welkom in de studio van De Blauwe Tijger. Wij hebben een speciale uitzending naar aanleiding van het boek van professor David Engels, klassicus, hoogleraar te Poznan, woonachtig in Warschau. En binnenkort verschijnt van hem bij uitgeverij De Blauwe Tijger zijn boek Op weg naar het imperium. De crisis van Europa en de ondergang van de Romeinse Republiek. Over dat boek zullen we het later nog in meer detail hebben. Vooral de analogie die professor Engels schetst tussen de ontwikkelingen in de Europese Unie en de ondergang van de Romeinse Republiek en de opkomst van de dictatuur, het keizerrijk. En daarover gaan we dus later in meer detail hebben. In dit uur willen wij nadenken over de geopolitiek. Wat is nou precies de rol van Europa op het wereldtoneel, ook als we kijken naar de instabiliteit van de Europese Unie, denk aan de Brexit. Ook als we kijken naar de opkomst van supermachten als India en China en onze relatie tot Rusland en de Verenigde Staten. Nou, dat lijkt me al een hele hoop om in 1 uur te bespreken. Maar laten we beginnen met de laatste decennia, het einde van het communisme. Laten we even een rond getal nemen, ongeveer 1990. Toen is er een einde gekomen aan het communisme en, nou dat zeg ik dan maar even in mijn kinderlijke fantasie, was dat niet een heel mooi moment geweest om juist toenadering te zoeken tot Rusland. En in plaats daarvan zien we juist dat in de loop van de decennia daarop die kloof eigenlijk steeds groter is geworden. Hebben we daar een kans gemist, professor David Engels? En is het ook ooit een realistische optie geweest om inderdaad Rusland toe te laten tot de NAVO, de Europese Unie?
Yes, hello, good evening. And first, thank you for the invitation to this discussion. Yes, that was certainly a missed opportunity to include Russia into the political sphere of the Western world. But on the other hand, it was of course very comprehensible given the state of unrest of Russia, given also the insecurity about who governed Russia really at that moment, and also the wish, of course, of the Western state to see Russia even more crushed so that it could be used in an ever better way. And we shouldn't forget also Russia is such a big piece of a cake that it is not easy to assimilate it.
But was it ever, I believe there is a certain misunderstanding about that. Was it ever seriously proposed by either the European Union or Russia at that time to form an alliance?
Well, at least we see that there have been proposals, at least from the Russian side. We shouldn't forget, for example, Putin's brilliant speech before the German Bundestag, where he, I think, in some honesty at least, proposed such an adhesion. Of course, we have to be very careful about to what extent it is really meant or it's only a signal, but it is at least not a signal, or it has not been a signal of hostility, but one of a honest wish of a certain rapprochement between both powers. But that has been missed, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, to continue this discussion, we are talking with David Engels in English. He is a Belgian from the German-speaking community in Belgium. A very small language group in the Federal Republic of Belgium, or the Kingdom of Belgium. But you understand Dutch, but
I can't speak it very well. So
you don't command it actively. Okay.
Fortunately.
So let's continue in English. And Tom, what's your view on this? Was there ever a moment of serious, the possibility of a serious alliance between Russia and Western Europe?
Yeah, I think there was a serious, very serious alliance, and I think the West was very much into accepting Russia as an alliance, but only in a defeated way. We can remember Boris Yeltsin. He was a kind of puppet of the Western elites, and he applied for the NATO membership, and it was denied by Clinton, the Clinton administration, I think. and afterwards, I think there were 3 moments in total, 3 official requests from Russia to have the NATO membership by Yeltsin and Putin, and attempts from Russia to attain the EU membership. And why it didn't happen is actually a little bit strange. So you can only see it as that the West wanted to how to say that, to have a defeated ally, and or a strong enemy. So
Yes.
Both options are. But a strong ally wasn't an option, and at any moment in the history. So that wasn't a possibility.
And what happened? Did Russia become a defeated ally, or?
I think the West many times or had fought a long time that Russia was a defeated ally.
Yes.
Or yeah, and but at the same time they denied the membership all the time.
Yes.
So there was a
weak enemy.
Yeah, a weak enemy or a weak ally. The West has doubted that for years and years, until Russia, under the leadership of Putin, became stronger and stronger and stronger, and had gained more influence in the region and also in the world. And then you could see the decision was absolutely no NATO membership, no EU membership, or whatever. It was it had to be an enemy, and that wasn't the choice of Russia. You can clearly say that Russia applied for the membership of both the EU and the NATO for a long time.
Yeah.
And even I think if you ask Putin now, he would say immediately, yes, we can start negotiations, and it wouldn't be Russia who frustrate the deal.
No. Okay. In your book, you sketch a vision of a future Europe that will, on a given moment, come in a position that it has to consolidate its outer boundaries. Where will Europe's boundaries be in the future? To what extent can Europe expand? Because right now there are discussions about Albania, Macedonia. What's the end game here?
This is, of course, a question that is very difficult to answer to, but the study of past civilizations at least shows us the tendency of civilizations in their late or last phase of development to cover the whole extent of the civilization with some kinds of final state, like the Roman Empire, like the Qin or Han Empire, like, for example, also
Qin or Han?
the Qin or the Han Empire in ancient China.
China, yes.
Or the Gupta Empire, for example, in India. So that is why I expect also for the last phase of the evolution of the European society or civilization also some kind of final empire. Of course, it's difficult to say where its limit will be, because that depends on the definition what is Europe, what is not. Will Russia ever want to be a part of Europe? Because it's not only on us to decide if we consider is it part, but also on whether Russia will want also to consider itself as part of the West or as a separate civilization. But what is sure is that the Balkan region, of course, is from a strategic point of view, as also from a cultural point of view, part of the European sphere of influence and of culture, and that it has to be sooner or later to be incorporated also in some form of European state.
Well, what I found fascinating about the discussion about Albania and Macedonia was there's hardly any talk about formal requirements in terms of democracy, finance, economics, etc. Of course, there is some debate about it, but the ultimate argument seems to be if we don't incorporate Albania and Macedonia, maybe Russia will, or China will. It seems to be a discussion about spheres of influence.
We saw that already during the Greece crisis. You may remember, for example, when we had this huge debt crisis in Greece, that Tsipras, for example, spoke about a rapprochement with Russia, for example, instead of with the European Union. So there is a real fear, of course, of seeing some territories escape the influence of the European Union. And now we are reverting to good old imperialism, which has at least the advantage of being more realistic, pragmatic, and mathematical than all the talk about values, democracy, which obviously is only some form of facade.
It seems to be a facade. There's no real limit. Albania is a failing or a failed state. I think nobody has any illusions about the prospects for democracy, economics, etc. But at least it's our failed state and not not the Russians or that's. But what is the prospect for Russia? Do you think it will, in the end, form an alliance with the European Union?
Well, I hope so, I would say. I hope so because if we don't manage to integrate one way or the other in a peaceful way Russia into the European sphere of influence, but also, of course, in a fair and partnership way, then we have to fear that Russia will ally itself even more to China, and that then there will be a frontier not along Siberia, but more or less some perhaps 100 kilometers east of Warsaw, where I'm living. And so I have a net preference for a farther frontier and of a Europe that would also have access to these enormous riches, of course, of Siberia, and not be confined to this very, very small continent. But before that can be done, of course, there are many, many problems which need to be solved with Russia, and territorial issues are, of course, also a very important part of all that. And that will be very difficult.
Tom, you also thought a lot about geopolitics. We know you from your book, Permafrost. Do you share Professor Engels' analysis on Russia?
Yeah, let's go back to Albania and North Macedonia first, because when I wrote Permafrost, I studied about Albania, and I found that George Soros and a few other very, very rich men are very powerful in Albania. Like the province Kosovo has the most extended NATO bases, army bases in the world. So it's also called NATO-stan. But Albania, so the motherland of Kosovo, so to speak, is almost entirely in the hand of a couple of very, very rich men. It's a privatized country. So it's a country without any public culture or sphere or whatever. I even don't understand why they applied for an EU membership or a NATO membership, because they don't need it. Albanians are all over Europe. They control most mafia organizations in Europe. They lead human trafficking organizations between England and Turkey. So
but what's the gain for the Western Soros-like investors? Do they like to own a country? Or?
That's very interesting. Why are they so powerful in that quite central country in Europe, and in the middle of human trafficking routes, in the middle of Africans going to Europe, in the middle of Asians going to Europe or England, and it's a very easy country to control for someone with a couple of billions, actually, because it's cheap to buy, I think. So it's speculation. So I find it quite odd, actually, why Albania and in a sense also Macedonia applied for the NATO and the EU.
It could also function like Malta, for example, which is of course not as which is quite corrupt, actually, and it offers all kinds of benefits for
But those like Cyprus, etc., they have a lot of financial institutions, banks, etc., and they have a lot of advantages for the elites. So they have a very specific function in the region. And I'm not sure about Malta, but you see the banks on Cyprus. You see the so-called philanthropists in Albania, or they use those countries as bridges between certain regions which are opposed to each other, which are supposed to have iron curtains or frontiers, like between Russia, the Russia-China ally, and the Western constellation of countries.
Okay, and Russia, that was my initial question.
Yeah, and China,
So will Russia in the end lean more towards China, or will it find its way to Europe?
I think Russia is very aware of the fact that China is maybe even a greater threat to Russia than the West is. Simply because the Chinese, they have the dream of a greater China, which is obvious in China. You find it everywhere that the Chinese actually want to have Siberia, or in eastern parts of it, because Siberia is empty, it's full of resources, and it's Russia's main exit to the oceans, actually. So it's strategically it's very important for Russia, but demographically China needs to expand, needs the resources, and now they do it in Africa. So they use Africa's resources, which is very successful, I think. So the plan to occupy eastern Russia is in the fridge for a while. But for how long? I don't know actually. But I think the Russians realize it very, very well how careful they should operate with China, and how diplomatic. Fragile.
Is this typical for our Western European short-sightedness, that we always focus on our border with Russia and we don't realize enough that it has a very large border with China? And do we reflect on that enough?
That is totally missing. As you said, the most important border of the Western world is our border as a civilization with China. That's really obvious. And Russia is, of course, in a dilemma, as Tom said. Either they try to join the European Union, but that is for the moment accompanied with a whole set of liberal leftist ideology, which would lead Russia ultimately to abandon large parts of its traditional identity. They can't do that. But allying with China makes them a junior partner.
It's actually suicide for Europe not to have Russia in the EU, because putting the border with China, literally on the border with China, for Europe it would be the best to survive. And to have Russia as an ally, is the only way to survive, I think, on the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's of course the problem also of our short-sighted vision of politics, is that we are much more dealing with so-called values or moralizing issues or saving the climate or things like that, but not thinking about the hard facts which will dominate our world in the 21st century. So we are missing many opportunities and still think we are the crown of the world, whereas the real evolution is happening elsewhere.
Yes.
We do not even understand, or most people in Europe do not even understand, that the future belongs anyway to China, and that it has largely already surpassed us in many respects. So that's really a tragic misunderstanding.
And the Chinese are even planning how to deal with India. So they're ahead of us, because China is turning from a production society to a consuming society, which means that they outsource the productions they do now for the world economy. Everything in the world is made in China. Almost everything, and the Chinese are planning. They're building cities and airports big as no one has ever seen before. Because the plan for China is every Chinese should use the airplanes and have access to resources we in Western Europe have, and they want to do it for every of those 1.5 billion Chinese people.
With the big difference, of course, that China is now trying to create little Chinas elsewhere in order to export or to delocalize their own productions, but without doing the errors that we did, because we thought that we could simply let the Chinese do our products and finally get the richer out of it. We miscalculated, but the Chinese know exactly how they can keep in control of these countries they develop with their investment. So that's a huge problem. They are creating a row of satellite states around them, whereas we missed all these opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah, good point.
As we speak of the European Union, there's also a debate on the need for a European army, for example. Do you consider that to be a realistic option for the near future, that the European Union will have a more independent foreign policy and maybe even a European army?
Yes, but with a certain caution. I think that the European Union, as it is for the moment, should certainly be not trusted with an army, because we know that its ideology is more or less counterproductive to the real interests of the West. But on the principle, that is, if we would have a European Union, or at least some form of European federation that would really defend our interests, our traditions, our way of being, then the fact of it having an own army in order to protect, for example, its Mediterranean frontier, but also its border with Russia and perhaps later with China, would be an absolute necessity, of course. But that's a long way still ahead of us before reaching that state.
The development we can observe nowadays is more towards destabilizing than towards a consolidation of power, it seems. When we look at the massive protests in various European countries, a communal foreign policy seems not very realistic at the moment. Is that connected in some way? The sense of a European identity and the need for a common foreign policy and army.
Exactly. Identity, or one of the main markers of identity, is of course a common foreign policy, the identification behind one ideal in order to fight for or against someone else. So an army foreign policy will be an important element to add if Europe wants to find its own identity. But the problem is once again that in its current state, the European Union is everything else than an institution that defends the traditions, the interests, the essence of the West.
Exactly.
For the moment,
yes.
that would even be extremely dangerous, but on the long run, it is a very desirable evolution.
Yeah. Talking about identity, I want to leave Russia aside for this moment and focus on Turkey and on the Islam. You mentioned, you raised the question earlier today, will Islam be a global player, or will it remain a disruptive force? Tom, I give you I asked the question to you, and you are free to say something about Turkey as well. But let's focus on Islam in the first instance.
Okay, that was the question already. I think Islam is clearly a disruptive force. There is almost no organizational talent in Islam. So I think to have an organized army completely destroying Europe, it's hard to imagine. On the other side, I don't see Turkey as a pure Islamic state. It's a very organized state actually. some of it is visible in the fact that the CIA has its most is most active in Turkey. All over the world, the activity of the CIA is at its peak in Russia, or Turkey.
Turkey, yes.
And that's very interesting. So for the CIA, for decades, Turkey is their key country, and NATO has large bases over there, and they're all American, of course. So there is an element about Turkey that they want to control. They want to keep it secularized, to keep Islam far away from the governmental structures of Turkey. But yeah, there's also a moment coming very soon, I think, that Turks feel their power and they say, well, what are all these secular foreign powers doing in our country? The CIA, the NATO, you know, the whole.
It will take control of its own destiny.
Yeah, the whole word, deep state. The word on itself comes from Turkey, because the deep state is invented in Turkey. The forces very deep in the governmental structures to control the presidency, to control the judges, to control the public offices.
So Turkey is likely to remain a kind of hybrid zone between Western interests
for a while,
and the Arabic world.
Yeah, for a while, I think so. Yeah.
For a while,
yeah,
and after
it will not be the same for a year. You know, it won't be the same to eternity. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, the powers that are trying to disrupt the deep state or to influence it, are they weakening or are they stronger? And that's the question. You saw in the Obama administration that they really tried very actively to influence the deep state in Turkey, with coup attempts, etc. And now it's much more quiet. The Turks they don't have the same trouble as they had during the Obama administrations. So it's very interesting. Yeah, Turkey is one of the key countries to watch, and to see what's going on in the world.
Okay, you mentioned the role of the NATO in Turkey, and Turkey is a very important member, strategic member of NATO. Would a stronger European Union and maybe even a European defense force, would that not be a positive development, in the sense that it would enable Europe to take its own direction in international politics and be less to be less dependent on the United States?
The EU as it is now, I described it in my book Permafrost, very much follows the dogma that or the doctrine that the enemy abroad is the same as the enemy within. So it's a kind of state rationality that they use foreign enemies to suppress enemies inside, like minorities or even all of the citizens.
Dissidents.
Not only dissidents, but also
fight Visegrad in order to fight the populist zone.
Yeah, and they keep it's the enemy abroad is used to keep the level of tension in our own countries at a relatively high level, not too high, but high. So it's meant that people are not falling back in their own peaceful neighborhood, in their own peaceful life. They need to be in a state of mobilization.
Okay.
I agree fully with David that the EU, as it is now, it would be very ugly for to have an army and to because they can use it at the borders, but it's more likely they use it inside because
Okay.
at the end they're not interested in the enemy abroad because they only use the enemy abroad to fight the enemy within. And
So to control citizens.
yeah,
so to
and
speak, yes.
for
But you're
instance,
also,
you can imagine that that German soldiers are used by Macron to suppress with a lot of violence the Yellow Vests protests, or that
the Spanish protesters.
say, for instance, Dutch secularists or atheists are mobilized and volunteer to beat the Polish Catholics, or and that
Okay, but
the Scots
yeah.
are used to beat the Greeks. That's the real strategy. That is built up now, I think.
Okay, but you in your book you also criticize the transatlantic policy of the European Union,
The dependency on
dependency on the United States. So with the provision that David mentioned, once Europe has a clearer sense of its own identity, then it would be a good thing to have a European army? Or do you remain skeptical about it?
I remain skeptical, yeah, but and it's also a matter of skills, as I wrote in the book, that once you have a kind of as a power, you have a kind of skill, a huge skill, and you think, well, now we can control this groups and that one, and you can control little countries around you. Well, the fact you have a big skill is only it's only a matter of time when those other small minorities they unite and they create a counterforce to oppose the skill, and then you get a battle of skills until you're left with one big power on top. So if we are talking about the world today, we have a couple of blocks. You have America, Russia, Europe, maybe not even Europe. It's not really united, and India. China, yeah. And those 5 blocks are they spend most on military, and you can see they build up a real power. So it will. I think it will only lead to one world government. I fear that
Okay, but that's beyond our scope now. We talked about the outer borders of Europe.
But that's about the question. Do you want a European army or not? And I think there is a lot to say that we shouldn't do that, because the army can be used inside Europe, and I don't think they will really use it outside, only for humanitarian missions or in the Middle East or Africa, but they are doing that already. So
they only use it for the good things.
Yeah, and I think
for the humanitarian things.
The risk is, of course, that without such an army, Europe, fragmented as it is, may become the playground of the other nations, transforming Europe into what the Holy Roman Empire in the 17th century was. That is, states bought by China, by India, by the US, by Russia, and set on a course to fight each other. So in some way, the question is more and more, do we want to have an authoritarian government based in Brussels or an authoritarian government based in Beijing?
Yeah, but it's the question, if that is the question. Yeah. And I'm not sure about that.
Okay, and let's go with your scenario for a while. What would the role of Turkey be in that stronger Europe? Would it in the end be a part of it, or has that ship sailed?
I think that the more and more Europe will find again its own identity, its essence, and try to renew with its traditions and in history, and the more Turkey will appear as a very estranged and different country with no hopes at all to one day accede to the European Union. But it could become eventually, who knows, an interesting partner. But it would never really be a part of a European sphere of influence that would really try to define itself through Christianity, through its history, which is essentially based also on the opposition between Occident and Orient. So I think that would shift the focus of today's politics very strongly.
I want to switch back to Tom's analysis. He said there's always the interplay or the dialectic of focus on the center and the focus on the border. You need an army to to control your borders, but also to establish a center of power. Will the European Union in the future be a more centralized empire than it is now? Will the difference between the member states and the regions and the autonomy of the member states decline in the end?
Based on the analogies with past civilizations, yes, most certainly. And this army will be used against its own citizens. I mean, that was already the case within the Roman Empire, where the legions spent most of their time more or less idle at the frontiers, but were systematically used inside to fight civil wars or even to quell civil unrest, or to be used even against the city of Rome. We shouldn't forget that, for example, the whole power of the emperors reside in the fact of having the Praetorian Guards within the city of Rome, where they could used every day by the emperor against its own population. That's something I wouldn't necessarily welcome with great enthusiasm, but that's how that's how things
inevitable.
Happen. That's inevitable.
Yeah, okay.
That's what they did in ancient China. That's what happened even in the Abbasid Caliphate, for example. This evolution happens, and I don't see any way of going another path.
Are you waiting for that the whole process of building up powers, and in the end you have 3, 4 superpowers competing for world power? Do you wait for the moment that it collapses, or how do you see that? Do you see 1 or 2 powers winning during the next decades, or maybe even a century?
Well, that's a very hypothetical question. Of course, it's very difficult to answer to that. I think that these different power blocks, India, China, Europe, let's keep Russia outside, the US, are closed enough in itself, not necessarily to look for a military conflict. I think they are saturated in some way. They do not necessarily have territorial claims on each other. Perhaps apart from Russia, they're very far away from each other. So it does not necessarily have to go through an armed conflict. We can imagine, for example, a situation as also in the Roman Empire, as between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, which was its immediate neighbor, where the Parthian Empire, who dominated today's Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. Right. And so we had every 50, 100 years some clashes, some skirmishes.
But normally these empires can coexist peacefully.
In one way or the other, trying to show that they are, of course, always superior. The Romans always had the impression of being superior to the Parthians and vice versa. But still, that could be some kind of uneasy cohabitation.
Yeah. And what is, in your opinion, the role of the United States in the future? Tom sketched this scenario of American army bases all over the world, America trying to influence all kinds of regions in the world. This last development of President Trump calling back his troops from Syria, could that be a sign of a more isolationistic approach, or?
Isolationist, or perhaps a return to the Pacific, as already started under Obama. That is, that the US sees that its power is shrinking and that it has to concentrate everything not on its east, but rather on its western front. But we shouldn't forget that already on the middle term, we are speaking about Europe, but in the US, which will fundamentally change from now. Europe, at least Western Europe, will be dominated much stronger by Islam. much power, most of the power centers and urban communities in Western Europe will be Islamized. So Europe will radically change also its look on foreign policy. And we shouldn't forget that the US, as we know them today, as dominated by the West elites, will become a more and more Hispanized state, nearly a Latino American state, which interests and scope may also radically change. So in 20 years, we will perhaps speak still about the US and the EU or some form of Europe, but their essence might fundamentally be different from today. So we shouldn't only project today's dynamic in the futures, but also think about that these states might very well change their real essence.
So we've heard your vision on the development of American foreign policy. It leaves me with the impression, since you're so skeptical about a European army, that Europe will be the odd one out, the one semi-superpower with some kind of dysfunctioning single market and maybe even more dysfunctional army.
Yeah.
What will Europe's role be also in terms of military prestige?
Yeah, I think these are two separate things. I think when all countries of the EU will leave the EU, the economic sphere, and then there is waiting another alliance like and it exists now from Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, I guess. They have a treaty, they can trade and have a valuta exchange. It's very easy to adapt to that alliance, much more easier than to keep the euro. So, and that's the first thing. I think that the EU,
but that's a scenario.
The EU isn't necessary to have treaties with all other countries, and those structures are already there outside the EU.
Okay.
And the other thing.
So you imagine an alternative European Union,
yeah,
on different preconditions.
Economical and financial. Those two. There is a structure. It exists already, and we can use that. And that then the military aspect is much more different because I think the EU, as it operates now, is like a lame duck. You know, it's doing nothing because all the countries keep each other lame. And when Europe falls apart and keeps the economical and financial structures as those countries like Iceland and Switzerland have with each other, but they can operate military and diplomatically alone. I think.
Are you referring to the EER, Europese Economische Ruimte?
I'm not. I don't know exactly when the treaty between Iceland, Switzerland, and a few other small countries came to existence, but it's a very.
But it's not a treaty with the EU.
No,
it stands on
they
itself.
have it alone. Yeah, they
right.
have.
Yes.
They have between those countries.
Okay,
yeah.
let's shift.
The second, the military. I'm convinced that when, for instance, Germany or France don't have the EU or don't have each other to keep each other lame as a lame duck, to create a lame Europe, I think you will immediately see a very, very strong Germany opposed to China. Germany is the engine of the European economy, and if there is one economy in the world, I think now, that has all capabilities to oppose China, not to beat it or whatever, but to oppose it and to keep all the region of Europe alive, then it's Germany. And the fact that it doesn't work this way is because of two things. I think the American occupation from '45, which has a destructive influence on the German spirit. And second, the EU itself and countries that keep each other in a burggreep.
Paralyze each other. Okay, Professor Engels. Tom sketches the possibility of a dysfunctional EU, and that there, in your scenario, the EU will remain more or less the same, but will change its administration, will become more authoritarian. Tom has a more open-ended scenario. He thinks there can emerge different structures and different alliances between European states that are functioning better. So the EU will maybe disappear or will be replaced gradually by other alliances. Do you think that's a realistic scenario?
I don't think that both scenarios exclude each other. I think that Tom is rather speaking about the short and middle term scenario, and I about the long term one. Indeed, I also think that the EU in its current shape is paralyzed, and indeed Germany is its main motor. But we shouldn't forget that the German economy is more or less finished. The Germans didn't invest anything in their infrastructures for years and years, so the country is totally downridden. They didn't invest anything more or less interesting or amount of monies in research, in industry, and so on. So China has by long surpassed also the German possibility of innovation. So we shouldn't expect anything of that. For the moment, there's much more money invested probably in gender studies in Germany than in any serious artificial intelligence studies, for example. So keeping up with what China or the US have done, it's illusory, even more so as China has now 20 times more also inhabitants than Germany, which is an aging society with its use more or less imported from Islamic countries. So I think that will be rather an element in the destruction or fragmentation of the European Union, and then afterwards I think that the period of unrest which is coming will then see the emergence of real shared interest between the different countries. They will all share the same problems. For the moment, we are not recognizing the problem of demographics, of Islamization, and so on.
So Tom's alternative configurations of European powers is part of your disintegration.
It may be a transitional state, but at the end,
and will in the end give way to a more authoritarian structure that will be able to compete with other superpowers.
Compete as much as possible. I mean, we shouldn't have any illusions, but Of course, an interesting question that would go perhaps a bit too far is to see how much further China or non-European civilizations will be able to develop our technologies which have been developed essentially in Europe. Will they be able to keep up with them? Will they really be able to continue them? Or will, once Europe definitely disappears or the West disappears from the number of serious technological innovators, will there also be a stagnation again in Eastern Asia? That's of course also an interesting question that could change the power balance once again, perhaps in 30, 40 years.
I agree in your analysis that the infrastructure in Germany is completely bad and that the investments in research are going down. But usually you see the global or the national investments in research. The only companies making profit of it are the multinationals, like pharma, the big pharma, the chemical. But I think the engine, the way I see Germany as the economical engine of Europe, is not the multinationals and the large companies, and not the big research aligned with that. But I think the SME, so the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, and in that way, Germany, I think, will stay Germany forever. It's connected to the small and medium-sized.
Yes, but the moment they need 5G internet, they will be dependent on China. I think.
I don't think we need 5G internet at all. In the same way as we don't need airports for
every small city.
Okay.
It's a kind of.
You're talking more about a vital civic society, entrepreneurial society.
It's about vitality and the power to revitalize the small economic initiatives. And I think Germany has never left the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs.
The real economy, production.
Yeah, but I see it clearly that it goes down, right? That they paralyze or that they advantage the multinationals and they paralyze the small companies. So it's clearly the same as it is here, but in the Netherlands. But I see that the large countries like even France, but Germany and also the United States, they have an enormous hidden economical engine, and that's not the Silicon Valley. It's not the car town Stuttgart. It's not the the fatality of every economy is the small business, and I still have. I see the potential in Germany is very high to revitalize it in a very short time.
Yes. Okay. So that's what I want to close with. You talked about revitalizing European economies and European societies. You wrote about the renovation of Europe, so let that be our hope for this moment. And later on we will talk in more detail about the historical analysis of your book on the crisis of Europe and the downfall of the Roman Republic. Thank you so far. Tom, hartelijk dank voor jouw bijdrage. En dit was het voor dit uur over het boek van professor David Engels. En graag tot de volgende keer.